the Christmas Eve chimney sweep death. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where mysteries unfold like morning mist over a quiet village. I'm your narrator, William, and today I'm sharing a tale that Miss Marple herself recounted to me one winter evening as we sat by her fire. She spoke of a Christmas that brought not joy but justice to the village of Little Pembridge. Before we begin this chilling winter tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Your messages warm my heart during these cold December nights. Let's step into Miss Marple's world together. Chapter 1. The Soot-Stained Carol. The village of Little Pembridge wore its Christmas preparations like a well-loved winter coat, comfortable, familiar, and slightly frayed at the edges. Miss Jane Marple observed the bustle from her window seat at the copper kettle tea room, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she watched the villagers hurry past with parcels and pine boughs. "Such a shame about poor Mr. Grimshaw," said Mrs. Pennyweather, the tea-room proprietor, as she refilled Miss Marple's cup. "And on Christmas Eve morning, too. What a dreadful way to go!" Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "Mr. Grimshaw, the chimney sweep." "Oh yes, didn't you hear? Found dead in Colonel Hartley's chimney just this morning. Smoke inhalation, they say. The Colonel's beside himself. He'd hired Grimshaw specially to clean all 8 chimneys before his Christmas party tomorrow." "How very distressing," murmured Miss Marple, though her blue eyes had sharpened with interest. "I suppose these old manor chimneys can be quite dangerous." "That's just it." Mrs. Pennyweather leaned closer, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "My nephew Tom, who works with the fire brigade, says the flue was blocked solid. Someone had lit a fire in the grate while poor Grimshaw was up there working. Can you imagine?" Miss Marple could indeed imagine, and what she imagined troubled her greatly. She knew Samuel Grimshaw by reputation, a skilled sweep who'd worked these parts for 15 years, too experienced to begin work without checking for blockages or fires below. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Colonel Hartley at Pembridge Manor. She found the Colonel in his study, a glass of brandy trembling slightly in his weathered hand. Inspector Craddock from Much Benham had just concluded his preliminary investigation. "Miss Marple," the Colonel rose stiffly. "Kind of you to call. Ghastly business. The man was checking the drawing-room chimney when it happened." "Had Mr. Grimshaw worked for you before?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "First time, actually. Mrs. Whitmore at the post office recommended him. Said he'd done excellent work on her chimneys last month. Charged a pretty penny for repairs, but she said he'd found dangerous cracks that could have caused a fire." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "Indeed? And who else knew Mr. Grimshaw would be here today?" "Well, I mentioned it at the parish council meeting, and Grimshaw himself was in the holly bush last night, telling everyone about his busy Christmas Eve schedule. Had 3 houses to do. Mine, the Weatherby's, and finishing at Rose Cottage." "Rose Cottage? But that's Mrs. Blackthorn's house. I thought she was spending Christmas with her sister in Portsmouth." The Colonel shrugged. "Changed her plans, apparently. Decided to stay after all. Can't say I blame her. First Christmas since she lost Harold in that terrible fire last February." Miss Marple's needles had resumed their clicking, though her mind was working even faster. Harold Blackthorn's death had shocked the village, a chimney fire that had spread to the bedroom while he slept. His wife Margaret had been at her weekly bridge game and returned to find the fire brigade battling the blaze. The insurance had paid out handsomely, enough for the widow to rebuild Rose Cottage entirely. "Colonel," Miss Marple ventured, "who discovered the blockage in your chimney?" "The fire brigade when they pulled poor Grimshaw out. Packed solid with rags and newspaper, they said. Tom Pennyweather reckoned it must have been done recently, within the hour before Grimshaw went up." Which meant, Miss Marple reflected, that someone had deliberately murdered Samuel Grimshaw on Christmas Eve morning, turning the season of peace into a time of carefully planned death. Chapter 2. The Widow's Grief. The following morning, Christmas Day, dawned crisp and bright over Little Pembridge, though a shadow lay across the village festivities. Miss Marple attended the morning service at St. Mary's, noting the conspicuous absence of several parishioners, including Mrs. Margaret Blackthorne. After church, Miss Marple made her way to Rose Cottage, a basket of Christmas pudding and mince pies on her arm. The cottage, rebuilt after the fire, stood pristine in its newness, almost uncomfortably perfect against the weathered stones of its neighbours. Margaret Blackthorne answered the door herself, dressed in black despite the 10 months that had passed since her husband's death. Her face, once round and cheerful, had grown thin and sharp, as if grief had carved away everything soft. "Miss Marple, how unexpected. On Christmas Day? I thought you might appreciate some company, my dear. Such a difficult time of year when one is in mourning." Mrs. Blackthorne led her to the sitting room, where a small fire crackled in the new grate. Miss Marple noticed the woman's eyes flicker toward it nervously. "I heard about Mr. Grimshaw," Mrs. Blackthorne said, pouring tea with hands that trembled slightly. "Such a tragedy. He was supposed to come here yesterday afternoon, you know. I had to cancel at the last minute." "Oh? Was there a problem?" I simply couldn't face it, having someone working on the chimneys after what happened to Harold. The memories, you understand." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she noticed the appointment book. Open on the side table, December 24th, clearly marked with Grimshaw, 3 p.m. in fresh ink. "Mr. Grimshaw did work on your original chimneys, didn't he? Before the fire?" Margaret's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Yes, about a month before. He found several problems. Cracks, loose mortar. Said we were lucky he'd spotted them. The repair bill was substantial, but Harold insisted we pay it. Safety first, he always said." Her voice caught on the last words. "Yet there was still a fire," Miss Marple observed gently. "The insurance investigator said it was a different issue entirely. A bird's nest in a flue Grimshaw hadn't checked. Just terrible luck." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Through the window she could see the church tower where yesterday Samuel Grimshaw had rung the bells for the last time, as part of his secondary job as bell ringer. He'd been a fixture in village life, yet how much did anyone really know about him? "I suppose Mr. Grimshaw's death brings it all back," she ventured. Margaret stood abruptly. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple, but I'm feeling unwell. Perhaps you could visit another time." As Miss Marple departed, she noticed something peculiar. A pair of men's Wellington boots stood by the back door, far too large for Margaret's small feet. Fresh mud clung to them, though it hadn't rained in 3 days. Moreover, the mud had that distinctive reddish clay colour found only near the old quarry, and Pembridge Manor backed onto those very same quarry paths. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Whitmore at the post office. The postmistress was a fountain of village knowledge, and Miss Marple had long ago learned that a sympathetic ear could unlock that fountain. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful about Mr. Grimshaw? And I was the one who recommended him to the Colonel. I feel simply awful." "You mustn't blame yourself, dear. How were you to know? Tell me, when did Mr. Grimshaw repair your chimneys?" "November it was. Found terrible damage he said could have caused a fatal fire. Cost me nearly £200, but what's money compared to safety?" "Indeed. And you were satisfied with his work?" Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. "Well, yes, though it's odd you should ask. My brother-in-law is a builder. Came for Sunday lunch last week. He glanced at the chimney work and said it looked like someone had deliberately damaged the mortar before repairing it. Fresh damage, he called it. But surely Mr. Grimshaw wouldn't... I mean, why would he?" "Why indeed," thought Miss Marple, unless Samuel Grimshaw had been running a tidy little scheme, creating the very problems he was then paid handsomely to fix. And if someone had discovered this scheme, particularly someone who had lost everything because of it, Christmas Eve might have seemed the perfect time for revenge. Chapter 3. The Insurance Papers. Boxing Day brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. Inspector Craddock arrived mid-morning, looking harried and holding a folder of papers. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might have your thoughts on something. We've been investigating Grimshaw's background and some rather interesting facts have emerged." "Do come in, Inspector. I've just made fresh tea." Settled in Miss Marple's cosy sitting room, Craddock spread the papers across the coffee table. Samuel Grimshaw was doing very well for himself. Bank statements show deposits far exceeding what a chimney sweep should earn, even with his church bell ringing on the side. Miss Marple studied the figures. These larger deposits seemed to correlate with dates about a month after his repair work. How curious. That's what we thought. We've also discovered he had a contact at Pemberton Insurance Company, a clerk named James Tilney who processed claims. Tilney's disappeared, but we found evidence he was feeding Grimshaw information about which households had good insurance coverage. So Mr. Grimshaw would damage the chimneys, charge for repairs, and if a fire occurred despite his repairs, the insurance would pay out handsomely. Exactly. We've identified 6 suspicious fires over the past 2 years. The Blackthorn fire was the only fatality, though. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "Tell me, Inspector, have you looked into Mrs. Blackthorn's movements on Christmas Eve? She claims she was at home all morning, preparing for a quiet Christmas alone. No one saw her leave. Yet someone who knew the manor's layout blocked that chimney and lit the fire. Someone who knew exactly when Grimshaw would be in that particular chimney." Craddock frowned. "You're suggesting Mrs. Blackthorn? But she cancelled her own appointment with Grimshaw." "After he was already dead, perhaps. A convenient alibi. Tell me, what time was the appointment at the manor?" 9 o'clock sharp. Grimshaw was always punctual." "And the fire at Rose Cottage last February? What time did that start?" Craddock consulted his papers. "Around 9 in the evening. Mrs. Blackthorn was at her weekly bridge game at Mrs. Patterson's. Ironclad alibi." "Yes," murmured Miss Marple. "She certainly seems to have alibis. Yet grief and rage can make people quite clever, Inspector. Has anyone checked whether she actually attended that entire bridge game?" That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Patterson, one of the Bridge Circle regular members. After the usual pleasantries about Christmas and sympathy for poor Mr. Grimshaw, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward that February evening. "Such a shock about Harold Blackthorn," Miss Marple said. "Margaret was with you that evening, wasn't she?" Mrs. Patterson nodded. "Yes, though she arrived late and seemed distracted. Kept making mistakes in her bidding. Left early too, said she had a headache. If only she'd stayed. Perhaps she might have been home in time to save Harold." "What time did she leave?" "Around 8:30, I believe. The fire started at 9, didn't it? She must have arrived home to find it already burning." Miss Marple made a mental note. 30 minutes. Enough time to return home, ensure the chimney fire was spreading properly, then leave again to discover the tragedy. Later, Miss Marple visited young Tom Pennyweather at the fire station. The eager fireman was happy to discuss the technical details of both fires. The Blackthorn fire was unusual, he admitted. Chimney fires usually burn up and out, but this one burned down into the bedroom, as if something was blocking the top of the flue, forcing the fire downward. "Like rags and newspaper?" Tom's eyes widened. "Exactly like that, but we never found evidence of blockage afterward. It must have burned away completely." "And yesterday's blockage at the manor?" "Same materials, but packed tighter. Whoever did it wanted to make sure Grimshaw couldn't push through it. They wanted him trapped when that fire was lit." Miss Marple walked home through the village, passing Rose Cottage where a light burned in the front window. Margaret Blackthorn stood silhouetted against the lamplight, staring out at the dark street. Their eyes met for a moment, and Miss Marple saw not grief but something harder, the cold satisfaction of justice served, even if by her own hand. Chapter 4. The Bell Ringer's Secret. The funeral of Samuel Grimshaw took place on a grey December morning, 3 days after Christmas. The church was surprisingly full, though Miss Marple suspected many attended out of curiosity rather than genuine mourning. She positioned herself where she could observe the congregation, particularly Margaret Blackthorne, who sat rigidly in a rear pew. Reverend Clement conducted a modest service, carefully avoiding any mention of the suspicious circumstances of Grimshaw's death. As the church bells rang, someone else pulling the ropes that Grimshaw had handled for 5 years, Miss Marple noticed Margaret flinch with each peal. After the service, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, pretending to tend to her sister's grave while watching the mourners disperse. She observed Dr. Haydock approach Margaret Blackthorne, saw her shake her head firmly at whatever he suggested, probably a sedative for her nerves. "Miss Marple?" She turned to find Edward Weatherby, owner of Weatherby House and one of Grimshaw's scheduled customers on that fatal Christmas Eve. "Mr. Weatherby, how are you managing?" "Truthfully, relieved I cancelled Grimshaw's appointment. My wife insisted we go to her mother's for Christmas Eve instead. When I think that might have been us." He shuddered. "You cancelled? When?" "The week before. Grimshaw wasn't pleased. Said I was disrupting his careful schedule. Rather odd, really, how insistent he was that it had to be Christmas Eve or not at all." Miss Marple filed this information away. "Tell me, did Mr. Grimshaw ever find problems with your chimneys?" Weatherby laughed bitterly. "Every year like clockwork. Always something that needed expensive repairs. My wife started calling him the Christmas expense we could count on. Last year he claimed we nearly had a catastrophic failure, cost us £300. Did you ever get a second opinion?" "Funny you should ask. I did, actually last spring. Had my nephew look. He's a proper builder. Said the damage looked fresh, too fresh. Almost like someone had taken a hammer to it recently." His face darkened. "You don't suppose—" "I try not to suppose without evidence," Miss Marple said gently. "But I believe Inspector Craddock would be very interested in your nephew's assessment." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the church to speak with Reverend Clement about the bell-ringing schedule. She found him in the vestry, sorting through Grimshaw's bell-ringing notes. "He was meticulous about his schedule," the Reverend said, showing her a leather journal. "Look, every Sunday, every wedding, every funeral for 5 years. He even noted when he'd be away and needed a substitute." Miss Marple studied the journal carefully. "How interesting. He's marked Christmas Eve as unavailable, working, but then crossed it out and written special arrangement, early morning only." "Yes, I asked him about that. He said he had important chimney work that couldn't wait but promised to ring the bells for early service. He was here at 6 in the morning, right on time." 6 o'clock, then to the manor by 9. What did he do in those 3 hours? The Reverend shrugged. "I assumed he went home for breakfast. He lived alone in that cottage on Mill Lane." But Miss Marple wondered. 3 hours was a long time for breakfast, and Grimshaw's cottage was only 10 minutes' walk from either the church or the manor. Where had he spent that time? She decided to visit Grimshaw's cottage, which the police had finished examining. The landlady, Mrs. Price, let her in with much tutting about the rent owed. "Always paid on time before," she complained. "Had the money too. I don't understand why he lived so modestly when his bank account was so healthy." The cottage was sparse but clean. Miss Marple noticed immediately that while Grimshaw's work clothes hung in the wardrobe, his best suit was missing. Why would a chimney sweep wear his best suit on a working day? In the small desk she found something interesting. Carbon copies of letters Grimshaw had sent. Most were routine, but one, dated December 15th, caught her attention. "Your accusations are unfounded and slanderous. My work has always been of the highest standard. If you continue to spread these lies, I will be forced to take legal action. S. Grimshaw. No addressee was visible on the carbon, but the threatening tone was clear. Someone had confronted Grimshaw about his scheme. A second letter, dated December 20th, was even more intriguing. I accept your proposal. Christmas Eve morning as agreed. The matter will be settled then. S. Grimshaw. Miss Marple sat back thoughtfully. Grimshaw had arranged to meet someone on Christmas Eve morning, someone he'd previously threatened, someone who had evidently made him a proposal he felt worth accepting. But what kind of proposal would a corrupt chimney sweep accept from someone who knew his secrets? Unless, of course, it was a proposal that led him directly to his death. Chapter 5. The Clay and the Confession. On New Year's Eve, Miss Marple hosted her annual tea for the church flower arranging committee. It was a smaller gathering than usual. The recent tragedy had dampened spirits. Margaret Blackthorne had been invited but declined, claiming a headache. "She's been poorly since Christmas," Mrs. Patterson observed. "Dr. Haydock's been calling twice daily." "Guilt, if you ask me," said Mrs. Price, Grimshaw's former landlady. "She knows that man's death is connected to her husband somehow. Mark my words." Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward lighter topics, but her mind was working. After her guests left, she wrapped herself in her warmest coat and walked to the old quarry path that connected Rose Cottage to Pembridge Manor, the path where that distinctive red clay could be found. The evening was clear and cold, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Miss Marple walked slowly, her torch beams scanning the path. Halfway along she found what she was looking for, deep footprints in a patch of red clay preserved by the dry weather. Men's boots, size 10 or 11, the same size as those Wellingtons in Margaret Blackthorne's cottage. But more interesting was what she found nearby, a small piece of fabric caught on a bramble. Grey wool, good quality, from a man's suit. Grimshaw's best suit, perhaps, worn on Christmas Eve morning for his special appointment. She continued to the manor, where the path emerged near the servants' entrance. Anyone familiar with the estate could have entered unseen, especially early on Christmas Eve when the staff was busy with preparations. The next morning, Inspector Craddock called on Miss Marple with significant news. "We've found James Tilney, the insurance clerk. He's confessed to feeding Grimshaw information about policies in exchange for payment, but he swears he knew nothing about the actual fires." "I believe him," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Tilney was just a greedy opportunist. The real guilt lies elsewhere. Tell me, have you investigated the timing of Harold Blackthorne's insurance policy?" "Increased just 2 months before the fire. Margaret Blackthorne insisted on it, according to their broker. Said she was worried about the value of Harold's collection of first editions, which conveniently survived the fire, being in his study downstairs. Inspector, I believe we've been looking at this backward. We assumed Grimshaw's scheme led to Harold's death accidentally. But what if Margaret Blackthorne discovered the scheme and used it deliberately?" Craddock leaned forward. "You mean she knew Grimshaw had damaged their chimney?" "More than that. I believe she confronted him about it, threatened to expose him unless he helped her stage an accident. But Grimshaw was just meant to damage the chimney. She lit the actual fire. When Harold died, she had her insurance money, and Grimshaw had a hold over her." "Blackmail?" "Initially, perhaps. But Margaret is cleverer than that. She lured him to Pembridge Manor on Christmas Eve with a promise, probably money, enough to make him wear his best suit to collect it. She knew the Colonel's household routine, knew when Grimshaw would be alone in that chimney." "Can we prove any of this?" Miss Marple produced the piece of grey fabric. "This matches the suit jacket in Grimshaw's cottage. It proves he was on the quarry path. Those boots in Margaret's cottage will match the prints. And I suspect if you check carefully, you'll find she purchased the rags and newspapers used to block the chimney. She's been planning this since she learned Grimshaw would be working Christmas Eve. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock and Constable Welling called at Rose Cottage. Margaret Blackthorne received them in her sitting room, pale but composed. "We need to ask you some questions about Christmas Eve morning, Mrs. Blackthorne." "I've told you. I was here all morning." "Then perhaps you can explain why your boots left prints on the quarry path, and why fabric from Samuel Grimshaw's suit was found caught on brambles along that same path." Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "This is absurd. You're suggesting I murdered that man?" Miss Marple, who had accompanied the police, spoke gently. "I think Mr. Grimshaw's death was justice in your eyes. He caused your husband's death through his greed and negligence. The law couldn't touch him, so you took matters into your own hands." Margaret stood abruptly, walking to the window. For a long moment she was silent. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Harold was asleep. The smoke should have woken him, but he'd taken his sleeping medicine. I found the receipts later, you see. Grimshaw's repairs, the damage he'd caused. I pieced it together." "So you decided to kill him the same way?" Margaret turned, her eyes blazing. "He murdered my husband for money. Harold never hurt anyone. Grimshaw destroyed our lives for a few £100, and he was going to keep doing it to others." The confession, once started, poured out like water through a broken dam. Chapter 6. The Christmas Meeting. Margaret Blackthorne sat down heavily, her hands trembling as she began her full confession. Inspector Craddock activated his tape recorder while Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles still. "It started in October," Margaret began. "I was going through Harold's papers for the insurance settlement, and I found something odd. A receipt from a building supply company for chimney repair materials, dated 2 days before Grimshaw supposedly discovered the damage. Harold must have bought them for some other project, but the coincidence bothered me." She paused, pouring, herself water with shaking hands. "I hired a proper surveyor to examine our other chimney, the one that hadn't burned. He found tool marks, deliberate damage that had been partially repaired. That's when I knew. Grimshaw had caused the problem he'd been paid to fix." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Inspector Craddock asked. Margaret laughed bitterly. "With what proof? The chimney that killed Harold was destroyed in the fire. Grimshaw would have denied everything. So I started investigating myself. I spoke to others who'd hired him, carefully and directly. The pattern was always the same. Damage discovered, expensive repairs, and sometimes fires." "How did you arrange the meeting on Christmas Eve?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I wrote to him in mid-December, told him I knew about his scheme. I said I had proof, Harold's diary entries, photographs he'd taken of the chimney before and after. All lies, but Grimshaw didn't know that. I offered him a choice: meet me to discuss a financial settlement, or I'd go to the police." She stood, pacing to the fireplace, staring at the flames. "He chose the money, of course. We met on the quarry path at 7 o'clock Christmas Eve morning. He wore his best suit, thinking he was coming to collect blackmail money. I told him the payment was at Pembridge Manor, that I'd hidden it there because I didn't want anyone to see us together at my cottage." "But there was no money," Craddock stated. "No, I knew the Colonel's routine, knew the servants would be busy with Christmas preparations. I led Grimshaw in through the servants' entrance. I'd been to enough of the Colonel's parties to know the layout. I told him the money was hidden in the drawing room, that he should check the chimney where I'd concealed it." Her voice had gone flat, emotionless. "He was suspicious at first, but greed won. While he went up to check, I blocked the flue with materials I'd prepared, rags soaked in paraffin, newspapers. Then I lit the fire. I used the same method he'd taught Harold inadvertently, a delayed ignition using a candle and paper trail, giving me time to leave." "You left him to die," Craddock said quietly. "The way he left Harold to die. The smoke would have overcome him quickly, Inspector. More merciful than Harold's death, The doctors said he tried to escape but was overcome by smoke in the hallway. Miss Marple spoke up. But why cancel your own appointment with him that afternoon? Cover story. I called his landlady that morning after it was done, left a message saying I was unwell. I knew he'd never receive it, but it established that I had no plans to see him. What about the boots? Craddock asked. Margaret actually smiled slightly. Harold's boots. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. Wearing them to the manor felt like Harold was with me, helping me get justice. Foolish, I suppose. And if someone else had been blamed for the murder, I would have come forward. I'm not a monster, Inspector. I just wanted justice for Harold. Grimshaw killed him as surely as if he'd lit that fire himself. The room fell silent except for the crackling fire. Finally, Craddock formally arrested Margaret Blackthorne for the murder of Samuel Grimshaw. She submitted quietly, seemingly relieved to have the truth revealed. As they prepared to leave, Margaret turned to Miss Marple. "How did you know? What gave me away?" "Several things, dear, but primarily it was the timing. You knew exactly when Grimshaw would be in that chimney, which meant you'd arranged it. The boots were Harold's, weren't they? A widow doesn't keep her husband's muddy boots by the door unless she's been using them. And the appointment in your diary. The ink was fresh, added after Grimshaw was dead to support your alibi." Margaret nodded slowly. "You understand why I did it, don't you? He would have kept killing people for money." Miss Marple's blue eyes were sad but knowing. "I understand the impulse, my dear. But taking the law into our own hands makes us no better than those we punish. Justice and revenge are not the same thing, however much we might wish them to be." As Margaret Blackthorne was led away, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy of it all. Lives destroyed by greed, then more lives destroyed by vengeance, a cycle as old as humanity itself. Chapter 7. The Insurance Investigation. The news of Margaret Blackthorne's arrest spread through Little Pembridge like spilled tea across a tablecloth. By evening, everyone had their own version of events, each more elaborate than the last. Miss Marple retreated to her cottage, declining all visitors except Inspector Craddock, who arrived the next morning with a thick folder. "The investigation has widened considerably," he explained, accepting a cup of tea. "Margaret Blackthorne's confession has opened up the entire Grimshaw operation. We've found evidence of systematic fraud going back 4 years. 4 years of destroyed chimneys and endangered lives," Miss Marple murmured. "How many victims, Inspector?" "At least 15 confirmed cases of deliberate damage. 3 resulted in fires, though Harold Blackthorne was the only fatality. Grimshaw was careful. He usually ensured the damage would cause problems, but not immediate danger. Harold's death seems to have been genuinely unintended. Which makes Margaret's revenge all the more tragic. Tell me, what of the insurance company's involvement?" Craddock's expression darkened. "James Tilney has provided a full list of claims he processed. He received £50 for each successful claim Grimshaw submitted. The total fraud amounts to nearly £10,000. And the victims who paid for unnecessary repairs? We're compiling a list. The insurance company will likely offer compensation, though it hardly makes up for the fear and disruption caused." That afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Hartley, looking older than his 70 years and leaning heavily on his walking stick. "I feel responsible," he said, without preamble. "If I hadn't hired Grimshaw, if I'd chosen a different day." "You couldn't have known, Colonel. Mrs. Blackthorne would have found another opportunity. Once someone is determined on murder, they usually find a way. Still, to think it happened in my home, that poor woman, driven to such lengths." He paused, struggling with his words. "I knew Harold Blackthorne. Good man. Boring as watching paint dry, but decent. Collected first editions, you know. Spent hours showing me his Dickens collection just a week before he died. It must have survived the fire being downstairs in his study. Yes, Margaret donated the entire collection to the church for their fundraising auction. Said she couldn't bear to look at them. Raised nearly £2,000. Miss Marple's needles paused. How generous of her. When was this? June, I believe. The Reverend was delighted, said it would fund the roof repairs completely. After the Colonel left, Miss Marple walked to the church. Reverend Clement was in his study working on Sunday's sermon. Ah, Miss Marple, these recent events have given me much to contemplate about justice and forgiveness. Indeed. I wondered about the Blackthorn book collection. Colonel Hartley mentioned the donation. Wonderful volumes. First editions of Dickens, Thackeray, even a Bronte. Harold had exquisite taste. Margaret insisted we sell them quickly, said they reminded her too much of happier times. Did she bring them herself? No, she had them delivered by a book dealer from London, Morton and Associates. They also handled the authentication for the auction. Very professional. Miss Marple made note of the name. Something about the books nagged at her, though she couldn't quite place what. The next day brought another revelation. Dr. Haydock called on Miss Marple with medical information about Harold Blackthorn's death. I've been reviewing my notes from the post-mortem, he said. Something's been bothering me. Harold had taken his sleeping medicine that night. A double dose, actually. It would have made him extremely drowsy. Margaret mentioned he'd taken sleeping medicine. Yes, but here's the odd thing. Harold rarely took it. He'd been prescribed it for occasional use, but the bottle was nearly full when he died. Why would he take a double dose that particular night? Miss Marple considered this. Unless someone gave it to him without his knowledge. In his evening cocoa, perhaps. That would explain the concentration in his system, but Margaret was at her bridge game. Was she? She arrived late and left early. 30 minutes unaccounted for before the fire started. Miss Marple's expression was troubled. Doctor, I fear we may have uncovered something even darker than we thought. That evening Miss Marple placed a call to Morton and Associates in London. After explaining her connection to the Blackthorn estate, she asked about the authentication process. Oh yes, the Blackthorn collection, the dealer recalled. Tragic circumstances. Mrs. Blackthorn was most insistent we handle everything quickly. Paid extra for expedited service. Did you notice anything unusual about the collection? There was a pause. Well, now that you mention it, one thing did strike me as odd. Mr. Blackthorn was known as a meticulous collector, but several volumes showed signs of recent handling. Fingerprints, small tears, even what looked like ash marks, as if they'd been rescued from a fire rather hastily. Miss Marple thanked him and hung up, her worst suspicions confirmed. The books hadn't been in Harold's study during the fire. They'd been removed beforehand, which meant Margaret's actions that night were even more calculated than anyone had imagined. Chapter 8. The Bridge Game Alibi. Miss Marple sat with Inspector Craddock in the police station's small conference room, the winter afternoon light filtering weakly through grimy windows. Between them lay an array of documents, photographs, and witness statements that painted an increasingly complex picture of Harold Blackthorn's death. You're suggesting Margaret Blackthorn planned her husband's murder, not just Grimshaw's? The inspector's voice carried a note of reluctance, as if hoping Miss Marple might reconsider her conclusion. I'm afraid so, Inspector. The books being removed before the fire, the sleeping medicine, her movements that evening, it all points to premeditation. She used Grimshaw's chimney damage as cover for murder. But why kill Harold? By all accounts, they were happily married. I've spoken to neighbours, shopkeepers, the vicar. Everyone says they seem devoted to each other. Miss Marple had been pondering this very question since her discoveries about the books and sleeping medicine. Appearances can be quite deceiving, Inspector. I think we need to examine their marriage more closely. Perhaps we should start with that bridge game, the one that provided Margaret's alibi. They drove to Mrs. Patterson's house, a handsome Victorian villa on the high street. Mrs. Patterson, a well-preserved woman in her 60s with carefully styled grey hair, received them in her morning room. She was initially reluctant to discuss the evening of Harold's death, fidgeting with her pearl necklace as she spoke. "It's painful to recall," she said. "We were playing cards while poor Harold was dying. If only Margaret had stayed home that night." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "But she was at your bridge game. Could you tell us about that evening? Every detail might be important." Mrs. Patterson poured fresh tea, her hands slightly unsteady. "Margaret was behaving strangely that whole month, actually. She'd been distracted during our games, making unusual mistakes in her bidding. Very unlike her, she was typically our strongest player. That particular night, she arrived about 20 minutes late, around 7:20. She apologised profusely, said she'd had to settle Harold for the evening. He wasn't feeling well, apparently." "Did she mention giving him medicine?" Miss Marple asked, accepting a cup of tea. "Yes, actually. She said she'd left him his cocoa and sleeping tablets on his bedside table. We joked that at least she'd have a peaceful evening without his interruptions." Mrs. Patterson paused, colour rising in her cheeks. "I shouldn't have said that. It sounds callous now." "Interruptions?" Inspector Craddock leaned forward. Mrs. Patterson looked uncomfortable, glancing between her visitors as if weighing how much to reveal. "Harold would sometimes call during bridge, asking Margaret to come home for trivial reasons. He'd claim to have chest pains or say he smelled gas or couldn't find his reading glasses. Margaret never complained, but we could see the strain. Once he called 3 times in a single evening." "How long had this been going on?" "Years, Inspector. It had gotten worse since Harold's retirement 2 years ago. He seemed to resent Margaret having any life outside their home. She'd tried to join the gardening club, but Harold made such a fuss about being left alone that she quit after 2 meetings. Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "And she left early that evening of the fire?" "Around 8:30. She said she had a headache, which wasn't surprising given how poorly she'd been playing." But Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then walked to the window. "I happened to glance out a few minutes later. I was checking if it might rain, you see. I saw Margaret on the street below, but she wasn't walking toward Rose Cottage. She was heading the opposite direction, toward the chemist's shop." This was new information. Inspector Craddock made rapid notes. "You're certain it was Mrs. Blackthorne?" "Absolutely. She was wearing that distinctive green coat of hers, the one with the fox fur collar. Harold had bought it for her birthday. Cost a fortune, he told everyone, as if she were a possession to be shown off." After leaving Mrs. Patterson, they visited the chemist, Mr. Prendergast, a thin, precise man who remembered the evening clearly when questioned. "Mrs. Blackthorne came in around 8:40, he confirmed, checking his records. "She purchased headache powders, my own special formulation. I remember because she seemed agitated, kept checking her watch, most unlike her usual composed demeanour." "Did she say anything else?" Miss Marple inquired. "Yes, oddly enough. She asked about smoke inhalation, said she was worried about their chimney problems, wanted to know how quickly someone could be overcome by smoke, whether they'd wake up in time to escape." "What did you tell her?" Craddock asked. "That smoke inhalation could be fatal quite quickly if someone was unconscious or heavily sedated. I warned her to make sure their smoke alarms were working properly. Ironic, really, considering what happened less than an hour later." He shook his head sadly. "If only I'd realised she was planning to go home, I might have offered to check on Harold myself." But Miss Marple wondered if Margaret had ever intended to go straight home. The chemist's shop was near a public telephone box, and the timing was suspicious. Their next stop was the fire station, where young Tom Pennyweather had been conducting his own review of that night's events. "I was going through our equipment logs," he explained, spreading papers across his desk. "On the night of Mr. Blackthorne's death, Our response time was delayed by approximately 3 minutes. Someone had called in a false alarm on the other side of the village just before the real fire was reported. Who called in the false alarm? Anonymous call from the phone box near the chemist's shop. A woman's voice reporting smoke at Elm Terrace. We sent one engine there first, found nothing, then got the real call about Rose Cottage. Near the chemist's shop, where Margaret had been seen, another piece of calculated misdirection. Miss Marple was beginning to see the full extent of Margaret's planning. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, studying Harold Blackthorne's obituary in the parish magazine. Devoted husband, collector, retired accountant who took pride in his home and gardens. But, between the lines, she read something else. No mention of friends, no club memberships, no hobbies beyond his books and making demands on his wife. An isolated man who had perhaps become too dependent on his wife's attention, too controlling of her movements. She remembered something Mrs. Clement had mentioned months ago at the church flower committee. Margaret had been taking evening classes in London before Harold's death, studying French literature at the community college. But Harold had made her stop after just 3 weeks, said he needed her at home in the evenings, that a wife's place was with her husband. The next morning brought a surprising visitor, Margaret's sister from Portsmouth, Mrs. Joan Weatherfield. She'd come to collect some of Margaret's personal belongings and asked specifically to speak with Miss Marple. Joan Weatherfield was younger than Margaret by perhaps 5 years, with the same intelligent eyes but lacking her sister's refined composure. She sat rigidly in Miss Marple's parlour, declining tea, her hands clenched in her lap. "I know what people must think," she began without preamble, "that Margaret killed for money, for freedom. But you have to understand, Margaret's life with Harold wasn't what it seemed. That devoted husband the obituary described, he was a tyrant in his own quiet way." "In what way, Mrs. Weatherfield?" "He controlled everything. He monitored her spending down to the penny, despite having plenty of money. She had to show receipts for everything, justify every purchase. He read her letters before she posted them, checked them when they arrived. The bridge game was her only freedom, and he resented even that, called her friends gossiping hens and bad influences." "Why didn't she leave him?" Miss Marple asked gently. Joan laughed bitterly. "And go where? With what money? Harold controlled everything. The house was in his name, the bank accounts, even her jewellery was in his safe, and he had the only key. He'd convinced her she couldn't survive without him, that she was too stupid to manage alone. He'd say it kindly, you understand, like he was protecting her from her own incompetence." Miss Marple's needles moved steadily as she absorbed this information. Did she ever speak of the chimney problems? Joan looked uncomfortable. "I shouldn't say this, but yes. She wrote to me about the damage Grimshaw found. She said—" Joan paused, then continued in a rush. "She said it felt like fate was offering her a way out, that if anything happened to Harold because of the chimney, at least she'd be free. I destroyed the letter after the fire. I thought she was just venting frustration, the way we all do when life becomes unbearable." "She wrote about it? When was this?" "Early December, just after Grimshaw did his inspection. She'd figured out he was running some sort of scam. She was always clever, despite what Harold told her. She seemed almost admiring of Grimshaw's cleverness. Said it took a special kind of person to create their own opportunities." Joan's voice dropped. "I think she saw herself in him. Someone trapped who'd found a way to take control." "Did she mention any specific plans?" "No, nothing concrete. Just possibilities. She wrote about the insurance policy Harold had recently increased, about how the valuable books would be such a comfort if anything happened to him. I thought she was fantasizing, the way prisoners dream of escape." After Joan left, Miss Marple sat in her garden despite the January cold, wrapped in her warmest shawl. The full picture was becoming clear, and it was more tragic than she'd imagined. Margaret Blackthorne hadn't just used Grimshaw's scheme. She'd improved upon it. She'd orchestrated Harold's death to look like an accident caused by Grimshaw's fraud, gaining not just freedom, but financial security and someone else to blame. She thought about the bridge game friends, how they'd seen Harold's behaviour but dismissed it as mere fussiness, how Margaret had maintained the facade of a devoted wife even as she planned her escape, the sleeping medicine in the cocoa, the books removed to safety, the false alarm to delay help, each step carefully planned, yet made to look spontaneous. Inspector Craddock called that afternoon with more information. We've checked the telephone box records. A call was made to Rose Cottage at 8:45 that night, just after Margaret left the chemist's. No answer, of course. Harold was already unconscious. She was checking he wouldn't answer, Miss Marple said, making sure the sleeping medicine had worked before she proceeded with the next phase. The fire? The fires, Inspector. I believe there were two. One in the chimney that would be blamed on Grimshaw's damage, and another in the study to destroy any evidence of Harold being drugged there. That's why some books showed ash marks despite supposedly being safely in the study. Margaret had to rescue them from the fire she'd started herself. It was, Miss Marple reflected sadly, an almost perfect crime. If Margaret hadn't felt compelled to kill Grimshaw, if she hadn't kept Harold's boots, if she hadn't worn them to the manor, she might never have been caught. But perhaps that was always the way with murder. The very traits that enabled someone to kill often led to their downfall. Chapter 9. The Truth About Harold. Inspector Craddock convened an emergency meeting at the police station the following morning. Present were the Chief Constable, Sir Geoffrey Pembridge, Margaret Blackthorne's solicitor, Mr. Whitcomb, and Miss Marple. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension as they reviewed the mounting evidence against Margaret Blackthorne. My client maintains she killed Grimshaw in retaliation for her husband's death, Mr. Whitcomb stated firmly, though perspiration beaded his forehead despite the cold morning. She has not confessed to murdering Harold Blackthorne, and I must advise against these fishing expeditions based on circumstantial evidence. Sir Geoffrey, a distinguished man with silver temples and the bearing of his military background, leaned back in his chair. Circumstantial or not, Whitcomb, the evidence Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock have assembled is deeply troubling. We have a woman who drugged her husband, removed valuable items from her home before a fire, established an elaborate alibi, and may have set that fire deliberately. The evidence suggests a clear timeline, Craddock said, laying out documents and photographs across the table like a dealer spreading cards. Mrs. Blackthorne gave her husband a double dose of sleeping medicine in his evening tea, not cocoa as she claimed. While he was unconscious, she removed the most valuable first editions from his study. She attended the bridge game to establish an alibi, left early, made a false fire report to delay the brigade's response, then returned home to ensure the fire spread. Speculation, Whitcomb countered, though his conviction seemed to be wavering. Where is your proof that she set the fire deliberately? Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting in the corner, spoke up. Perhaps we should examine Harold's study more closely. If Margaret removed books before the fire, there might be evidence of disturbance that the original investigation missed. The study at Rose Cottage had been rebuilt after the fire, but photographs from the insurance investigation remained. Sir Geoffrey had them brought in, and they spread the images across the table. Miss Marple produced a magnifying glass from her handbag and began examining them minutely. Here, she said, pointing to one photograph. Look at these shelves. Do you see the gaps in the dust patterns? Books were recently removed from these spots. You can see the outline where they stood. Yet Margaret claimed all the valuable additions were in the study during the fire. She could have removed them afterward, during the salvage operation, Whitcomb suggested. But look at this photograph of Harold's desk, taken by the insurance investigator the morning after the fire. Miss Marple continued. See the paperweight? It's been moved recently. You can see the dust outline where it originally sat. And there, that's a tea ring on the wood, still damp-looking in the photograph. But Harold was reportedly found in the upstairs hallway, overcome by smoke while trying to escape. Why would there be fresh tea stains if he'd gone to bed? Sir Geoffrey examined the photograph closely. You're right. That's definitely a recent tea stain. The wood around it shows water damage from the fire hoses, but the stain itself is distinct. There's more, Miss Marple said. This photograph shows the remains of Harold's reading chair. See the position? It's facing away from the door, toward the window. But Harold was reportedly paranoid about intruders. Mrs. Patterson mentioned he always positioned himself to see anyone entering. The chair has been moved. Inspector Craddock was making rapid notes. You're suggesting Harold was drugged in his study, not his bedroom? I believe so. Margaret served him tea in his study while he was examining his books, his nightly ritual, according to neighbours. The sleeping medicine was in the tea. Once he was unconscious, she faced a dilemma. She couldn't leave him there. It would be obvious he'd been drugged. But moving him upstairs would explain why he couldn't escape the smoke. But the fire was downstairs in the chimney, Sir Geoffrey began. 2 fires, Miss Marple interrupted gently. One in the chimney that spread to the bedroom above, the one that would be blamed on Grimshaw's sabotage, and another set deliberately in the study to destroy any evidence of Harold being drugged there. That's why some books Margaret supposedly saved showed ash marks and fire damage. She had to rescue them from the study fire she'd started herself, not the chimney fire. Dr. Haydock was summoned to review his autopsy notes again. He arrived within the hour, bringing his original files and photographs. If you're asking whether Harold could have been moved post-mortem, then yes, it's possible, he admitted, studying his notes. The body was badly burned, but the position always troubled me slightly. The way he was lying suggested he'd fallen backward, but the door frame showed marks indicating he'd tried to grasp it moving forward. Contradictory evidence I couldn't explain at the time. Could you determine if he was already dead when the fire reached him? The smoke inhalation evidence was present, but yes, looking at it now, it was less than I'd expect for someone who died from smoke alone. The sleeping medicine level was very high, potentially fatal on its own. I assumed he'd taken too much accidentally, trying to sleep through what he thought was a minor chimney problem. Or someone gave him too much deliberately, Craddock said grimly. That afternoon, Margaret Blackthorne was brought back to the station. She sat with her solicitor, still maintaining her composure, though dark circles under her eyes suggested sleepless nights. When confronted with the new evidence, she remained silent for several long minutes. The books were Harold's pride, she finally said, her voice barely audible. First editions of Dickens, Thackeray, Bronte, worth thousands. He loved them more than he ever loved me. Mrs. Blackthorne, her solicitor warned. She ignored him. Do you know what it's like to be a possession, Miss Marple? To be collected and displayed like those books, valued only for what you represent. The perfect wife, the devoted companion, the silent supporter. So you decided to free yourself, Miss Marple said gently. Margaret's composure finally cracked. Harold wasn't supposed to die. The sleeping medicine was just to keep him quiet while I removed the valuable books. I was going to leave him, sell the books to fund a new life. I'd earned them, hadn't I? 23 years of being his unpaid servant, his nurse, his audience for endless monologues about binding and paper quality. But something went wrong, Inspector Craddock prompted. I gave him the tea in his study. He drank it while showing me his latest acquisition, a first edition of Jane Eyre he'd bought with money we supposedly couldn't afford to spend on my mother's nursing home. He fell asleep in his chair within 20 minutes. I started removing the books, the ones I knew were most valuable. She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. Then I smelled smoke. The chimney fire had started. Grimshaw's sabotage was worse than even he knew. The damage was causing fires to spread between the walls. I tried to wake Harold, but he wouldn't respond. The medicine was stronger than I thought, or perhaps he'd already taken some on his own. He was breathing, but completely unconscious. "So you moved him upstairs," Miss Marple said. I panicked. I couldn't carry him out without being seen. Mrs. Henderson next door was in her garden. I couldn't call for help without explaining why he was drugged. If I left him in the study, everyone would know I'd drugged him. So I half carried, half dragged him upstairs, arranged him in the hallway where smoke victims are often found. He was still alive. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. Barely. His breathing was so shallow. I told myself he was dying anyway from the medicine, that the smoke would be more merciful. I went back downstairs, set a small fire in the study wastepaper basket to destroy evidence of the tea and the drugging, then left for the bridge game. And the false alarm? I wanted to delay the fire brigade, give the fire time to destroy evidence. I didn't expect it to burn so fiercely. The whole house was ablaze when I returned. The neighbours were already there, watching it burn. Her voice broke completely. Mrs. Henderson hugged me, told me there was nothing I could have done, but I knew better. "And then Grimshaw approached you," Inspector Craddock said. Margaret's expression hardened. 3 months after Harold's funeral, he'd figured out I knew about the chimney damage and hadn't fixed it. He didn't know about the drugging, but he knew enough. He wanted money to keep quiet. Regular payments, he said, to maintain his silence. That's when I decided he had to die. "So, you planned his murder?" "I planned his execution," Margaret corrected, some of her earlier fire returning. "He was a parasite who killed my husband. Yes, Harold died because of Grimshaw's sabotage, even if I helped it along. Grimshaw would have kept bleeding me and endangering others. He had 3 appointments on Christmas Eve. 3 more potential victims. I saved them." Mr. Whitcomb intervened. "My client is clearly distressed and not thinking clearly. I request we continue this tomorrow." But Margaret wasn't finished. "Do you want to know the worst part? I found Harold's will in his study safe. He'd changed it the week before he died. He was leaving everything to his nephew in Canada, with a small annuity. For me, sufficient for a woman of modest needs. 23 years of marriage, and I was worth less than his books." As the meeting concluded, Miss Marple found herself alone with Margaret for a moment, while the others discussed procedures. "You were very clever," Miss Marple said quietly. "Too clever, perhaps. If you'd simply left Harold that night, let the fire take its course without the drugging, you might have been free without becoming a murderer." Margaret looked at her with hollow eyes. "But I did drug him, didn't I? Once I started down that path, each choice led inevitably to the next. The drugging led to moving him, which led to setting the study fire, which led to the false alarm. And when Grimshaw tried to blackmail me, killing him seemed like just another necessary step." "The slippery slope of crime," Miss Marple murmured. "Is that what you call it? I called it survival. First surviving Harold, then surviving Grimshaw's blackmail. But you're right about one thing. I was too clever. If I'd just endured, Harold would have died eventually. He was 15 years older, with a weak heart." "But you couldn't wait." "No. That night with the Jane Eyre, watching him gloat over his purchase while my mother suffered in a substandard nursing home, something snapped. I saw my future stretching ahead, years more of the same, and I couldn't bear it." As Miss Marple left the police station, snow was beginning to fall, covering Little Pembridge in a clean white blanket that temporarily hid all the ugliness beneath. She thought of Margaret Blackthorne, who had tried to cover her own crimes with layers of deception, only to find that truth, like spring, inevitably reveals what winter has hidden. Chapter 10. The Final Threads. The trial of Margaret Blackthorne commenced on a bitter February morning, 6 weeks after her arrest. The courthouse in Much Benham had not seen such crowds since the war crimes trials of 1946. Every seat in the public gallery was filled, with people standing 3 deep at the back, despite the bailiff's attempts to maintain order. The press bench overflowed with reporters from London papers, their pencils poised to capture every salacious detail of the chimney sweep murders, as the tabloids had dubbed the case. Miss Marple attended each day, sitting in the same seat in the 3rd row, her knitting needles working steadily as she listened to the testimony. She had been called as a witness for the prosecution, her evidence instrumental in establishing the timeline of both murders. The familiar click of her needles seemed to provide a rhythmic counterpoint to the proceedings, a small island of normalcy in the midst of legal drama. The prosecution, led by Sir Reginald Fortescue, KC, presented their case with methodical precision. Each piece of evidence was laid out like pieces of a complex puzzle. The doctored sleeping medicine found traces in the teacup fragments recovered from the study, the removed books with their telltale ash marks, the calculated timing of the bridge game alibi, the false fire alarm traced to the telephone box near the chemist's shop. Then came the evidence of Grimshaw's murder, the blocked chimney packed with materials purchased from a shop where Margaret had been seen, the meeting on the quarry path confirmed by the fabric evidence, the boots that placed Margaret at the scene with their distinctive mud patterns. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sir Reginald intoned on the third day, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "we will demonstrate that Margaret Blackthorne committed not one but 2 murders, each carefully planned and coldly executed. The first, her husband Harold, killed for freedom and financial gain. The second, Samuel Grimshaw, murdered to silence the one person who could connect her to the first crime." The evidence was damning. Mrs. Patterson testified about Margaret's late arrival and early departure from the bridge game. Tom Pennyweather from the fire brigade explained the false alarm that had delayed their response. Mr. Prendergast, the chemist, confirmed Margaret's purchase of headache powders and her suspicious questions about smoke inhalation. Dr. Haydock presented his medical findings, explaining how the combination of sleeping medicine and smoke inhalation had killed Harold Blackthorne. But it was Miss Marple's testimony that proved most compelling. Over 2 days, she carefully walked the court through her observations and deductions, her gentle voice carrying surprising authority. She explained the significance of the dust patterns in the photographs, the moved furniture, the tea stains that shouldn't have been there. She described finding the fabric on the quarry path, matching it to Grimshaw's suit. She detailed the timeline that proved Margaret had opportunity for both murders. "Miss Marple," the defence counsel Mr. Whitcomb challenged during cross-examination, "you're not a police detective or a forensic scientist. You're simply an elderly lady with a fondness for knitting and gossip. Why should this court give weight to your amateur observations?" Miss Marple's blue eyes met his steadily. "You're quite right, Mr. Whitcomb. I am just an elderly lady, but I've spent my life observing human nature, and I've learned that people rarely do things out of character. When they do, there's usually a reason. Mrs. Blackthorne's actions on both December 24th and the previous February were entirely out of character for a devoted wife, unless, of course, she wasn't as devoted as she appeared." Margaret's defence counsel, despite the challenge to Miss Marple, fought vigorously. He argued for manslaughter rather than murder in Harold's case, claiming the death was an unintended consequence of Margaret's desperate attempt to escape an emotionally abusive marriage. He called witnesses to testify about Harold's controlling behaviour. The shopkeeper who confirmed Harold checked every receipt, the postmistress who admitted Harold read all of Margaret's mail, the gardening club secretary who described Harold's angry phone calls demanding Margaret come home. "My client was trapped," Whitcomb argued passionately. Harold Blackthorne had systematically isolated her, controlled her, reduced her to little more than a servant in her own home. The sleeping medicine was meant only to allow her to retrieve items that were rightfully hers, books purchased with marital assets, books she had as much right to as her husband. His death was a tragic accident caused primarily by Samuel Grimshaw's criminal sabotage of the chimney. For Grimshaw's death, Whitcomb pleaded temporary insanity brought on by grief and the discovery of Grimshaw's role in her husband's death. He called a psychiatrist who testified about the effects of prolonged emotional abuse and sudden trauma on rational thinking. Margaret Blackthorne snapped, he declared. Faced with blackmail from the man responsible for her husband's death, she acted not from malice but from a mental break caused by unbearable pressure. The prosecution's rebuttal was swift and decisive. Sir Reginald called James Tilney, the insurance clerk who had cooperated with authorities. Tilney's testimony revealed the full extent of Grimshaw's fraud, but also confirmed that the chimney damage, while deliberately caused, should not have been immediately fatal with proper smoke alarms and unconscious occupant. The fatal element, Sir Reginald emphasised, was the sleeping medicine administered by Margaret Blackthorne. Without that, Harold Blackthorne would have awakened, escaped, and lived. On the 10th day of the trial, Margaret herself took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in, every eye fixed on the woman in the dock. She wore a simple black dress, her face pale but composed. Under examination by her own counsel, she admitted to drugging Harold and planning to leave him. "I just wanted to be free," she said, her voice barely carrying to the back of the courtroom. 23 years I'd given him. 23 years of being told I was too stupid to manage money, too incompetent to have friends, too worthless to deserve anything of my own. The books were to be my freedom fund, my chance at a new life. "But you didn't just take the books and leave," Sir Reginald pressed during cross-examination. "You moved your unconscious husband, set a second fire, created false alarms. These aren't the actions of a panicked woman. They're the calculated steps of a murderer." Margaret's composure cracked. "You don't understand. If I'd called for help, if I'd admitted to drugging him, I'd have been arrested. Harold would have pressed charges. He'd have delighted in seeing me imprisoned. And then the fire started spreading, and I couldn't wake him, and I knew if he died, I'd finally be free." "So, you let him die?" "I chose my freedom over his life," Margaret said quietly. "Yes, I suppose that makes me a murderer. But Harold had been killing me slowly for years, killing my spirit, my independence, my sense of self. At least his death was quick." The jury deliberated for 2 full days. When they returned, the foreman, a middle-aged banker with a solemn expression, stood to deliver their verdict. The courtroom held its breath. "On the charge of murdering Harold Blackthorne, we find the defendant guilty of manslaughter." A ripple of surprise ran through the gallery. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "On the charge of murdering Samuel Grimshaw, we find the defendant guilty of murder." Margaret stood straight-backed as the judge, Lord Justice Pemberton, prepared to pass sentence. His words were measured, carrying the weight of law and moral judgment. "Margaret Blackthorne, you have been convicted of 2 terrible crimes. While the jury has shown some mercy in reducing the first charge to manslaughter, recognizing the difficult circumstances of your marriage, the fact remains that you took 2 lives. Your calculated murder of Samuel Grimshaw. Whatever his own crimes, cannot be excused by grief or provocation. You took the law into your own hands and executed a man based on your own judgment of his guilt." He paused, looking directly at Margaret. "I sentence you to life imprisonment with a recommendation that you serve at least 15 years before being considered for parole. May God have mercy on your soul." As Margaret was led away, she looked once at Miss Marple and nodded slightly. Whether in acknowledgement, farewell, or perhaps gratitude for being the one to uncover the truth, Miss Marple couldn't tell. Their eyes met for a long moment before Margaret disappeared down the stairs to the cells below. Outside the courthouse, Inspector Craddock found Miss Marple sitting on a bench in the small memorial garden, looking tired and older than her years. Snow was falling again, light flakes that dissolved as soon as they touched the ground. "Justice has been served," he said, sitting beside her. "Has it, Inspector?" A woman driven to desperate measures by circumstances she felt she couldn't escape. A corrupt man whose greed endangered innocent lives. Where does justice truly lie in such cases? "The law must be upheld, Miss Marple. You know that better than anyone." "Indeed I do. But I also know that life rarely offers us simple villains and heroes. Margaret Blackthorne was both victim and perpetrator, just as Samuel Grimshaw was both criminal and victim. The law sees only the crimes, not the long chain of circumstances that led to them." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the snow fall. Finally, Craddock asked, "What will happen to Rose Cottage?" "Margaret's sister will sell it, I believe. The proceeds will go toward compensation for Grimshaw's other victims, those whose chimneys he sabotaged. At least some good will come from all this tragedy." "And the village? Will Little Pembridge recover?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Villages always recover, Inspector. Like people, they have a remarkable capacity for healing. Give it a year, and this will become just another story told over tea and garden fences. The details will blur, the pain will fade, and life will continue as it always has." Back in Little Pembridge, that healing process had already begun. The Weatherbys had found a new chimney sweep, one who came highly recommended, and whose work was always inspected by an independent surveyor. Colonel Hartley had all his chimneys examined and repaired properly, at considerable expense, but with the satisfaction of knowing they were truly safe. The church bells had found a new ringer in young Tom Pennyweather, who took on the duty alongside his work at the fire station, bringing an energy and reliability that had been lacking in Grimshaw's final years. Spring came early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to wash away the darkness of winter. Miss Marple tended her garden with renewed vigour, watching as the village slowly returned to its normal rhythms. Mrs. Patterson's bridge circle found a new fourth player in Dr. Haydock's wife, recently returned from visiting her sister in Scotland. The vicar preached sermons on forgiveness and redemption, carefully avoiding specific references to recent events, but clearly drawing lessons from them. The Rose Cottage stood empty for several months, before finally selling to a young couple from London looking for a weekend retreat. They knew nothing of its history, and the estate agent, on advice from the seller, didn't enlighten them. Sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, ignorance truly was bliss. One April morning, 6 months after the trial, Miss Marple received a letter forwarded from the prison. The envelope bore the official stamp of Holloway Prison, and Margaret's handwriting, though still recognisable, showed signs of strain. Miss Marple opened it carefully, settling into her favourite chair by the window to read, "Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you well and that you don't mind me writing. I've thought long and hard about whether to contact you, but I feel there are things I need to say, things that couldn't be said in that courtroom. Firstly, I want to thank you for your words at the police station. You understood what others couldn't, that I was trapped in a web partly of my own making, partly of circumstance. You saw me not as a monster, but as a human being who had made terrible choices. I don't ask for forgiveness, only understanding, and you gave me that. Prison life is not as unbearable as I expected. There's a strange peace in having no choices to make, no deceptions to maintain. I wake each day knowing exactly what will happen, where I will be, what I will do. After years of walking on eggshells around Harold, then months of planning and executing my crimes, this routine is almost restful. I've begun teaching literacy classes here. The education officer says I'm a natural teacher, patient, clear, encouraging. It's bitter irony that I've discovered this talent now, when Harold always told me I was too stupid to do anything useful. Several of my students are women who, like me, killed their abusers. We don't talk about our crimes, but there's an understanding between us, a recognition of shared experience. I think of that Christmas Eve often. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be killing Grimshaw. Despite everything, I still believe he deserved his fate. He was a parasite who would have continued destroying lives for profit. But Harold, I should have been braver years ago. I should have left him, faced poverty, started over. Instead, I let resentment build until it exploded into murder. You said murder is like knitting. Once you start a pattern, each stitch leads to the next, until you've created something that can't be undone without destroying the whole work. You were right. That first decision to drug Harold led inevitably to everything else. I told myself each step was necessary, justified, even noble in Grimshaw's case. But really, I was just following the pattern I'd started, unable to stop until you unravelled it all. I've had time to think about why I kept Harold's boots. My psychiatrist, yes, they insist I see one, thinks it was subconscious guilt, a desire to be caught and punished. Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply couldn't let go of the last piece of Harold that had helped me gain my freedom. Those boots carried me to the manor, to my final crime, to my capture. In a strange way, Harold had the last word after all. I won't write again. This letter is my way of closing the chapter. But I wanted you to know that despite everything, I'm finding a kind of peace I never had as Harold's wife or as a killer hiding my crimes. The truth, however terrible, is preferable to living a lie. Thank you for seeing me as human, even at my worst. Margaret Blackthorne. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in her correspondence box. She wouldn't reply. What could she say that hadn't already been said in those moments at the police station? But she would keep it, a reminder that even the most carefully knitted patterns could unravel, that human nature was infinitely complex, and that justice and mercy sometimes pulled in opposite directions. That evening, as spring twilight gathered over Little Pembridge, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the village settle into its nighttime routines. Lights came on in cottage windows, families gathered for dinner, children were called in from play. The church bells rang the hour, Tom Pennyweather's steady hand on the ropes producing clear, true notes that carried across the village. She thought about the case that had begun with a death on Christmas Eve, about how Samuel Grimshaw's greed had set in motion events that destroyed 3 lives. She thought about Margaret, teaching literacy to prisoners, finding purpose in captivity she'd never had in freedom. She thought about Harold, controlling and desperate, dead, because he couldn't loosen his grip on the one person he claimed to love. Murder, she said softly to herself, picking up her knitting, is never just about the victim and the killer. It ripples outward like stones in a pond, touching lives in ways we can never fully predict or understand. Her needles began their familiar rhythm as she started a new pattern. Something simple this time, without the complex knots and twisted stitches that could so easily go wrong. A basic scarf, perhaps, or mittens for the church bazaar. Something useful and warm, without pretension or hidden meanings. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and Little Pembridge settled into peaceful darkness. The village had survived scandal, murder, and revelation. It would survive whatever came next, as villages always did, absorbing each crisis into its collective memory, until even the most shocking events became just another thread in the tapestry of its history. For in a small village, Miss Marple knew, there would always be another mystery, another pattern to unravel, another truth waiting to be discovered. But for now, there was peace, and that was enough. The clicking of her needles continued steadily into the night, a sound as eternal and comforting as the village itself, marking time and creating something useful from the tangled threads of yarn and life. Thank you for joining me today on Mindful Musings. Miss Marple wanted me to remind you that the truth, however carefully hidden, has a way of revealing itself. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to look closely at the patterns others miss. Like threads in a vast tapestry, our actions weave together in ways we never expect, and even the smallest stitch can unravel the most elaborate deception. Until next time, I'm William, wishing you peaceful nights and mystery-free chimneys.